shall toll in despair of my coming.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the 247th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Count Orlok, the Nosferatu. It's an exciting time of year here at the Violi, the month of horrors and frights that I've chosen to dedicate exclusively to covering horror villains for the past few years now. And this time around I felt it was about time I got to covering a character that you've all been requesting to be featured in an episode, Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror, about a year and a half ago as of the making of this video. Now there's no doubt that out of all vampiric creatures that can be found in both fiction and myth throughout all the various cultures of the world, that Dracula is the most well known, the titular character of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel that has been featured in or adapted by all manner of works across every medium. And while there have been hundreds made since that novel was released, there's always a first for everything, and in the case of Dracula adaptations, that first was Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror. Technically, the first adaptation of Dracula was a Hungarian film called Dracula Halala, but even though it has Dracula in its name, that film deviated from the original story significantly, and it has also unfortunately been lost to time, with no surviving copies of it existing anywhere. So for all intents and purposes, Nosferatu was the first mostly faithful adaptation of Stoker's novel. As I just mentioned though, Nosferatu is a mostly faithful adaptation of Dracula, with many of its story beats being identical to the original story, but different enough that it's typically considered to be its own separate story, and Nosferatu his own separate character, especially when you take into account the biggest difference between the two, that being Dracula's reimagining as the gangly, sunken-eyed, and considerably more monstrous Count Orlok. Now, as much as Egger's interpretation of the character is the one I've seen the most requests for, if you couldn't tell by the thumbnail, in this video, I've chosen to cover and compare all iterations of Nosferatu, for just like the creature that inspired his creation, there have been several adaptations of the original film made over the years. There are also several appearances the character has made in comic books, video games, and even episodes of TV shows over the years, but I figured it would be best, and a little more streamlined, to discuss only the film versions of the character in this video. But perhaps at some point in the future, I'll make an episode on all the other stories we find Count Orlok appearing in. All that being said, you might be wondering why I've chosen to cover Nosferatu first, and not Dracula himself. And the answer to that is because I have some interesting plans for my coverage of Dracula, and it'll be a while before that video is ready to go. But for now, I hope you enjoyed this window into the evil of one of the most iconic vampiric creatures ever created, and how his character has evolved over time. So without further ado, let's begin. Terrors are more terrifying than those that come by night. To witness horrors by the light of day is horrifying, but to experience them when darkness rules the land is another thing entirely. For the night, as beautiful as it can be, is also a realm of cold sorrow, a kingdom of shadows and mystery whose unholy sovereign is the dreaded Nosferatu. However, Nosferatu is not a name. No, it is a description, the taxonomical name for a creature belched forth from the foulest depths of hell to plague the world of men, a name that is purported to either be an archaic Romanian word for vampire, or a word derived from the Romanian term Nosferatu, which translates to the offensive or the insufferable one. This is a creature that was once a man, one whose given name has been lost to time, but who we know now only as Count Orlok. High up in the Carpathians in the province of Transylvania lies this beast's ruinous castle of horrors, and from within its depths it stirs upon nights most foul to feed on those that it will, and corrupt those who it can through disease. For Count Orlok is no mere vampire. He is a demon whose rise to such a position comes courtesy of one of the foulest lords of hell, the Prince of Darkness, Belial. From the seed of Belial sprang the vampire Nosferatu, who liveth and feedeth on human blood. This unholy creature liveth in sinister caves, tombs, and coffins, which are filled with cursed dirt from the fields of the Black Death. That is the origin of Nosferatu, and his progenitor Belial has been portrayed as being many different things throughout various Abrahamic mythologies. In the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, the term Belial is used to denote people who are particularly wicked or who lack worth. But in later texts, like in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Belial is the name given to an angel who has been given control over all demons by God, so he might perform all manner of evils on this earth. The Angel of Darkness, who is the necessary foil for the Angel of Light, that being God himself. And so it is that Belial has come to be known over time as the Prince of Darkness, and the ruler over all demons who lie at the edges of this world, waiting to unleash malice upon it. A demon who has also often been associated with plague and pestilence, a fitting father for the beast that we find in this story. However, to call Belial the father of this monstrosity isn't exactly accurate. We never get a line like this in the original film, but in Robert Eggers' version, Count Orlok is described as a black enchanter in life whose soul the devil preserves so that he may walk again in blasphemy, and that description feels accurate for every version of this character. In all versions of this story, Count Orlok communes with a man by the name of Ernok as a medium for his insidious will, and in the original film, the Herzog version, and the 2023 version, he does so through written communication, and in the Eggers version, he also communicates with him psychically. The psychic connection does much to promote the otherworldly powers of Orlok, but the odd language he uses to communicate with Nock in the other versions, and the ritual Nock performs in the Eggers version, gives us a bit more insight into what kind of black enchanter Orlok was in life. The script you see in the letters that Orlok writes to Nock in these films is a mixture of alchemical symbols and those from a constructed language called Enochian, a language invented by the occultist John Dee and Edward Kelly, which they claim to have received knowledge of from angels to use in the Enochian system of magic, which was then used by Dee and Kelly to summon angels and spirits. And the presence of this language in these films indicates that Orlok was likely a practitioner of Enochian magic in life. But that wasn't the only school of magic that Orlok was versed in. As we discussed earlier, Orlok is said to be the spawn of Belial, and though Belial's origin can be found in early Hebrew texts, his role as a prince of hell was greatly expanded upon through Goetia, a type of magic that has its roots in ancient Greece, where it was considered a lesser form of magic that eventually became more commonly associated across Europe with black magic, witchcraft, and the ritualistic summoning of demons, with one of the most common demons being invoked by Goetic magicians, being Belial. However, both of these systems could be considered subsets of the type of magic purportedly used by the progenitor of these types of magical arts, the legendary King Solomon. Solomon is said to have been the fourth king of the Kingdom of Israel and Judah, and he's also considered a prophet as far as Judaism and Islam are concerned, and an important holy figure in Christianity, though not quite a prophet. As important as Solomon is to the Abrahamic faiths, it's not his descriptions in the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran that matter as far as his relationship to magic goes. It's what's said of him in the Testament of Solomon. This text is said to have been authored by Solomon himself, first appearing written in Greek in the 1st century AD, and amended heavily by various authors throughout the many centuries since it was first created, though the veracity of the claim that Solomon is the author of this testament has been heavily debated since its creation. Regardless, the Testament of Solomon establishes that Solomon was once gifted a magical ring from the Archangel Michael to use to command demons, and the stories of his magical prowess and feats in this text is what established King Solomon as a legendary magician and spawned many a grimoire purported to contain the secrets of Solomon's magic, which has come to be appropriately known as Solomonic magic. The most famous of these grimoires are the Lesser and Greater Keys of Solomon, both of which deal heavily in instructing the reader in how to recognize and summon various demons and perform a multitude of spells, with two parts of the Lesser Key being named the Ars Goetia and the Ars Theurgia Goetia, with Goetia being synonymous with the Goetic magic that I mentioned earlier. With all this in mind, in all likelihood, Count Orlok was a Solomonic magician who dabbled in Enochian and Goetic magic in life, one who once summoned Belial and entered into a dark pact with him, a pact that saw him gaining great demonic and vampiric powers that then allowed him to continue living on well past his expiration date to become a veritable scourge upon the world. However, aside from being an aspect of Count Orlok's power in this story, the existence of Solomonic magic in it is crucial in another way. In Romanian folklore, there exists a type of wizard that Professor von Franz mentions in the 2024 version, the Solomonari. The Solomonari are said to be dragon riders who can control the weather, powers that they learn through attending the Scholomance, a legendary school of black magic supposedly ran by the devil himself, where the devil claims every 10th student as his own. And an 1885 article titled Transylvanian Superstitions by Emily Gerard, an article that talks about the Solomonari and the Scholomance, is said to be a source that Bram Stoker drew inspiration from when creating Dracula. Additionally, the members of the Solomonari were classified as Strigoi, who in Romanian folklore are spirits risen from the grave, who are capable of transforming into beasts, turning invisible, and who feed themselves by drinking the blood of their victims. So from the very conceptualization of its inspiration, Solomonic magic has been a staple of the Dracula mythos. And while there are a few lines in the Dracula novel that reference the Solomonari, it's clear that F.W. Murnau, the creator of the original Nosferatu, decided to weave in many more elements of Solomonic magic and the Romanian Solomonari into his version of the story, something that Robert Eggers expanded upon greatly in his reimagining of the film. Now at this point we've established more or less what Count Orlok is, and what he likely was when he was alive. And now that we've done that, let's go through the acts of evil that each version of this character commits to aid us in comparing them with one another later on. In all versions of this story, Nosferatu communes with Herr Nock, a real estate broker who resides in the fictional town of Wisburg, Germany, likely doing so after Nock performs some Solomonic rituals of his own searching for a demon to grant him great wealth and power. And after corresponding with Orlok for some time, Nock recruits his ambitious employee Thomas Hutter to embark on a mission to Orlok's Transylvanian castle to deliver the paperwork necessary for his acquisition of a ruinous mansion that lies across from Hutter's own home. Upon arriving, Hutter quickly learns that Orlok is not a man, but a creature who feeds himself with blood, sleeps in a coffin, and commands a horde of rats. And after spying Thomas's wife Ellen through a picture he carries with him, Orlok finds something further to motivate his move to Wisburg, a woman to covet that he might make into his unholy bride. Leaving Hutter for dead, Orlok travels by ship to Wisburg with his coterie of rats and a coffin filled with soil from his homeland in tow, along the way supping on each and every one of the crew members, until all have perished and a ghost ship arrives in Wisburg's port. A plague is then unleashed not long after that sees dozens of citizens falling ill and eventually perishing as the disease brought to their shores by Nosferatu ravages their bodies, with Herr Nock succumbing to further madness after his dark master has arrived in Wisburg. But after Ellen cleverly uses Orlok's fixation with her to draw her into her bedroom, he stays long enough for the sun to creep in through her window and end his unholy life. This is the general structure of each version of this story. However, all of them differ greatly in tone and characterization, with a few variations in the events that occur therein differing slightly between them as well. In the original film, the general atmosphere between sequences is defined by a contrast between the sense of happy wonder and whimsy of natural life, and the foreboding darkness of the unnatural life of Count Orlok. In this version, Nock is much more ghoulish from the start, with wild hair, dark eyes, an insidious smile, and a hunched stature that makes you wonder how anyone trusted this man with anything, even prior to the revelation of his servitude to Orlok. Orlok himself is much more animal-like in this version as well, with large pointed ears, wide eyes, and long sharp teeth that make his overall appearance quite rat-like. In this iteration, Orlok is a slow, methodical terror, measured in all of his movements, as if he's a being whose aged limbs have long since lost their quickness, or as if he is a creature that need not move quickly for anyone, for no mortal man may escape even the slightest movement of this demonic force once his gaze has fallen upon them, movements and mannerisms that are as unnerving as his ghastly appearances. Overall, this version of the character embodies the role of a slow-burning monstrosity quite well, with an atmosphere to match. However, the next iteration of this story, Werner Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampire, took the story in another direction entirely. In this version, the names of all the characters are actually reverted back to what they were in Bram Stoker's Dracula, Thomas and Helen Hutter being Jonathan and Lucy Harker, Nock being Renfield, Count Orlok being Count Dracula, and Professor Sievers being Van Helsing. The atmosphere of this version is much more melancholic in nature, with a muted and mournful score, copious shadows, and an ethereal sheen to it that makes it almost seem as if you're viewing someone's dream. Nosferatu himself is similarly melancholic, with a much more depressing and pathetic bent to his character, with his voice tiny and weak, and his visage constantly evoking some sense of dire sorrow that has likely plagued him for centuries. I don't attach importance to the sunshine anymore, or to glittering fountains, which youth is so fond of. I love the darkness and the shadows, where I can be alone with my thoughts. I am the descendant of an old family. Time is an abyss, profound as 1,000 nights. Centuries come and go. To be unable to grow old is terrible. That is not the worst. There are things more horrible than that. Can you imagine enduring centuries, experiencing the same futility each day? These are lines spoken by Dracula in the film that echoes the sad state of his existence. And throughout this film, it is the same sort of sadness and longing that serves as the focal point of it, a longing for a life long lost and a death well earned, and the madness that has resulted from such a creature that has endured so long in such a dreary state. Now, a year prior to the release of Robert Eggers' remake, there was another remake directed by David Fisher released that's nearly a shot-for-shot remake of the original film, only with dialogue included rather than it being silent. As others have noted, this is the weakest of the Nosferatu remakes, with stiff acting from its cast that doesn't do much to enhance the story. The cinematography isn't anything to write home about either. However, there is a nice mixture of red tones thrown into certain scenes that does enhance the feel of them significantly. As for Nosferatu himself, Doug Jones' performance as Orlok is rather interesting, as while it isn't necessarily too exceptional, his character personality-wise is very reminiscent of Bela Lugosi's performance as Dracula, making this version of the character a fusion of the two that I thought worked rather well. It's still Nosferatu, so if you'd like to see for yourself what it's like, you can watch it for free on Tubi as of the making of this video, but you're honestly not missing too much. And now we've come to the film that has caused so many of you to recommend this character for an episode in this series, Robert Eggers' Nosferatu. The original's dark and sinister tones were mere child's play, for this version of this story has elevated the horror of its contents far beyond anything Murnau could have imagined. From the very first scene of this version, the presence of Nosferatu can be felt, and will continue to be felt every second thereafter as you watch this movie. Rather than Nock being the one to first commune with Orlok and draw his attention, we find that it was Thomas's wife Ellen who did so in her young age when she cried out for a guardian angel, a spirit of comfort so that they might ease her loneliness. Unbeknownst to Ellen though, she possessed a certain amount of spiritual power that made this desperate wish more real than she ever could have imagined. For Ellen ended her prayer by pleading for a spirit of any celestial sphere to come and free her from her torment. Thus Count Orlok, the Nosferatu, was raised from a centuries-long slumber, and in raising him in this fashion, we find an interesting connection to the Enochian system of magic we discussed earlier. One of the most important aspects of Enochian magic is the communion with and summoning of angels, and while Ellen clearly wasn't some masterful Enochian sorceress in her youth, Orlok very well could have been in his, a Solomonic magician who once attempted to summon angels and failed, but who may have been able to tap into that magical current in some way that allowed him access to it forevermore, especially after he inherited a heap of dark power from the being he actually managed to contact, the archdemon Belial. So when Ellen pleaded for an angel to come to her aid, perhaps those were the only beings who could hear her plea. But once she had opened that current and then begged for a spirit of any celestial sphere to come to her, that's when Orlok caught her scent, latched onto her essence, and bound himself to a naive girl who would do anything to have a companion in this lonely life of hers. This then led to Orlok's connection to the sorceress Nock many years later, and his eventual physical union with Ellen following her husband's visit to his home. And it's during this visit that we're treated to a monstrosity far more horrifying than any other version of this character. Orlok speaks with a thick Eastern European accent, with a low and guttural voice, his words slow and methodical, as if all the dust of a long-closed crypt is exhaled from his lungs with every breath he takes. The sounds of an ancient creature whose mind has been consumed by the lust for carnage that flows through its veins. Orlok here is equal parts regal and bestial, a man with the gravitas and command of a lord of his station, yet the prowling figure and manners of a predator who makes his home in the darkest parts of the forest. He is hunger and plague personified, a walking blight upon all life that draws as much blood from the living as he inflicts them with pestilence unending that reduces them to ruins, with his psychic prowess further allowing him to destroy the minds of anyone that he sees fit to destroy. I am an appetite, nothing more. That is what Orlok declares himself to be, and that is what he is, a creature who has set his sights on Ellen as a woman not meant for humankind, who he wishes to possess, in the process seeing to the deaths of countless innocents through disease, and by his own hand, sundering the lives of even children, as he declares his intent to subsume Ellen's life into his own, after 3 nights upon his arrival in Wisburg. Like the other versions of his character though, Orlok is eventually defeated by the sacrifice of Ellen, the very woman who brought him out of his long rest, and in doing so, the terror of this creature is ended forevermore. But now that we've discussed all these iterations of his character, there is something more that needs to be said about the evil embodied by this demonic vampire. While clearly being a man who desired greater power in life, and who acquired that power through occultic means, the evil of Count Orlok is a bit more nuanced than the simple desire to prolong his own death and cause misery in this world that he would appear to embody on the surface. Throughout each of these versions of this story, there is a common theme present: lust, a lust for blood, a lust for carnal pleasure, and a lust for life itself. And because that is true, an appetite is perhaps the most apt description for this creature we've ever been given. Nosferatu represents humanity's baser desires, namely an insatiable need for sustenance and the carnal desire to breed, a desire in the primal sense, not in the godly one that people of the time period he haunts expect from one another. He is both the antithesis of life and an embodiment of the things that define life, and in doing so, he becomes the enemy of an organized society that has built itself up not to reject those things, but to control them for the sake of rising above our needs, so as not to be ruled by them. And in the case of the people we find in this story, to please a society molded around virtue and prudence. Orlok renounced all control over his animalian self in favor of an extended life and demonic power, becoming evil incarnate who does feed to sustain himself, but who sustains himself beyond what was allotted to him at the expense of any who might cross his path. And while Orlok's existence is indeed a scourge, in some ways, it is a scourge that allows those who he victimizes to see the folly in their ways. In Thomas, we find a realization that ambition is no replacement for love, and that which you can find in the moments you may miss if your eyes are focused solely on what might be. In Nock, Egger's version of Ellen, and Orlok himself, we find the dangers of meddling with dark forces and calling out to spirits to aid us in alleviating worldly pains or uplifting us beyond our stations. Evil is often fed by desire, a desire for wealth, a desire for power, a desire for love and lust. These things taken to the extreme are great sources of evil that can result in any one of us becoming monsters. But Orlok was a true monster, a man who had given away his humanity and his soul to become a living plague, one that has likely seen to the deaths of hundreds of innocents over the many years of his long existence. And for being what he is and doing what he did, there is no other label in this world to give this monster than that of pure evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Count Orlok? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, my members, anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and especially Elijah Kai VA, our Dark Lord channel member, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.